The Dead Sea Scrolls have been studied for over 70 years. Scholars have argued over every letter, every ink stroke, every crease in the parchment. But nobody thought to ask the skin itself what it remembered. When a team of scientists finally did, the answer came back in a language older than any alphabet: ancient DNA, preserved across 2,000 years of desert silence. And what that DNA revealed didn't just add a footnote to the story, it rewrote the story entirely. 900 texts, 50,000 fragments, decades of argument over where they came from, who wrote them, and whether pieces that look like they belong together actually do. Traditional methods, handwriting analysis, linguistic comparison, carbon dating, took scholars remarkably far, but they hit a wall. Some questions simply could not be answered by looking at the ink. So a team at Tel Aviv University spent 7 years doing something nobody had seriously attempted before. They stopped reading the scrolls as texts. They started reading them as biology. The stakes could not be higher. We are talking about the origin story of Western scripture itself, and the parchment, it turned out, had been keeping secrets. Here is the specific claim, and it is not speculation. Researchers extracted ancient DNA from the Dead Sea Scroll fragments, not from the text, not from the ink, but from the blank backsides of the parchment itself. Untouched surfaces, margins, the parts nobody had ever thought to look at scientifically. That was the first move, and it was quietly revolutionary. The team, led by geneticist Oded Rekavi at Tel Aviv University, developed a method to retrieve genetic material without destroying the fragments. These are irreplaceable artifacts. You do not get a second chance if something goes wrong. But the technique worked. And it worked on material that had spent 2 millennia in the extreme heat and dryness of the Judean desert, conditions that should have degraded DNA beyond any hope of recovery, conditions that, by every reasonable expectation, should have left nothing usable behind. What made the results even more astonishing was where some of the readable DNA came from. Archival tape, the kind used decades ago by early conservators who were trying, in good faith, to hold damaged fragments together. Nobody thought that tape would one day become a source of ancient genetic information. But even the dust trapped beneath those adhesive strips yielded sequences. Ancient sequences. Sequences that could be matched, compared, and traced back to specific animals that had been dead for 2,000 years. Think about what that means for a moment. Every fragment of parchment is, at its core, the preserved skin of an animal. A sheep, a goat, a calf. The scribes who wrote these texts were working on biological material, and that material retained a molecular memory that no amount of time, heat, or handling could fully erase. Rekavi described it directly. He said, and I am quoting him here, that from each piece they extracted the ancient DNA of the animal. Not a trace, not a hint. The actual genetic fingerprint of the creature whose skin became the page. That fingerprint became the key to something scholars had been unable to do with any other method. When 2 fragments share the same animal's DNA, the same individual animal, not just the same species, it is extraordinarily strong evidence that they came from the same original scroll. They are biological siblings, cut from the same hide. And when fragments have completely different DNA profiles, it tells you something equally important. They do not belong together, no matter how similar the handwriting looks, no matter how neatly the edges seem to align. The biology overrules the assumption. This is not a small methodological upgrade. This is a paradigm shift. For decades, scroll scholars assembled fragments based on visual judgment, the look of the script, the color of the parchment, the way one piece seemed to continue the text of another. Some of those assemblies were correct. Some, the DNA is now revealing, were not. Pieces were matched that never shared the same animal. Pieces were separated that almost certainly did. The physical puzzle that researchers thought they were slowly solving turns out to have had some of the pieces in the wrong places all along. And the species results, the answers to the basic question of which animal each fragment came from, those results did not come back the way anyone expected. The first assumption that had guided scroll research for years, the assumption that felt so obvious it barely needed to be stated, collapsed the moment the data came in. What was that assumption, and why did the DNA destroy it so completely? That is where this story takes its first sharp turn. For decades, the assumption was so obvious that almost nobody bothered to question it. Scholars looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls and concluded, almost universally, that the parchment had been made from goat skin. Goats were common in the ancient Near East. They were cheap, practical, and widely used for leather making across the ancient world. It was, by every reasonable measure, a completely sensible assumption. And it was completely wrong. When the DNA results came back, the data didn't waver. Across the sampled fragments, the genetic signatures pointed overwhelmingly to sheep. Not goats, sheep. The animal that had been quietly hiding in plain sight beneath centuries of scholarly consensus, beneath every learned hand that had touched those scrolls, beneath every careful reconstruction, was not the animal anyone had assumed. The first pillar of received wisdom about how these scrolls were made had just been knocked flat. And this mattered far more than it might sound. Knowing the species of the animal isn't just a biological footnote. It reframes the entire question of how the scrolls were manufactured and where the raw materials came from. Goats and sheep were not interchangeable resources in the ancient world. They were raised in different regions, by different communities, for different purposes. If the scrolls were made predominantly from sheepskin, that tells you something specific about the supply chains that fed the scribal community at Qumran. It tells you about the networks, the trade routes, the relationships with other settlements that had to exist for those scrolls to be produced at the scale they were. The DNA wasn't just identifying an animal. It was sketching the outline of an entire ancient economy. There was another consequence, one that cut even deeper into the established literature. For years, scholars had been assembling the Dead Sea Scrolls the way you might assemble a shattered photograph, matching edges, aligning text, joining fragments that seemed to belong together. Noam Mizrahi, a leading scroll scholar, had long acknowledged that these joins were, in his own words, always hypothetical. You could match the handwriting, match the column margins, match the text itself, and still not know with certainty that two pieces had ever been part of the same manuscript. It was educated guesswork, built on decades of careful visual analysis. Brilliant work, but still guesswork. DNA made it testable. For the first time, researchers could go beyond the visual evidence. If two fragments came from the same animal, their DNA would say so. If they didn't, the biology would say that too. And what the biology said, in several cases, was no. Some fragments that had been paired together, treated in publications as matching pieces of a single scroll, turned out to come from entirely different animals. Different genetics, different bodies. Possibly different places of origin entirely. Think about what that means for the reconstruction record. Every journal article, every museum display, every scholarly edition that relied on those joins now carries a question mark that wasn't there before. But the sheep versus goat revelation, as striking as it was, turned out to be only the opening move. Because two fragments in the sample broke the pattern entirely. They didn't match the sheep signature. They didn't match goat either. What the DNA found in those two fragments was something that, given where the scrolls were supposedly written, should not have been possible at all. Here is the specific claim, and it is not a small one. Two fragments from the book of Jeremiah came back as calfskin. Cattle. Not sheep, not goat. Cattle. And that single result, confirmed in peer-reviewed analysis published in the journal Cell on June 11, 2020, quietly detonated one of the longest-held assumptions about where the Dead Sea Scrolls were produced. Here is why it matters. Cattle cannot survive at Qumran. The site sits at the edge of the Judean desert, overlooking the Dead Sea. It is one of the most inhospitable environments in the ancient world. Scorching heat, almost no rainfall, scarce vegetation, brackish water. Goats can endure it. Sheep, with some difficulty, can manage. But cattle require green pasture, abundant water, a temperate climate. They cannot be raised in that landscape. They never could have been. Which means the calfskin used to make those Jeremiah fragments was not sourced locally. It couldn't have been. The only conclusion the data will support is this. Those manuscripts were written somewhere else and carried to Qumran. Let that settle for a moment. The scrolls were not all produced by a single isolated community scratching away at parchment in the desert. At least some of them, including fragments of one of the most theologically significant books in the Hebrew Bible, arrived at Qumran as finished documents, imported from a location with the resources to raise cattle. A location that was greener, wetter, more connected to the wider ancient world. And then there is the second corroborating detail, which makes this even harder to dismiss. The Jeremiah text found in the Dead Sea Scrolls is not identical to the standard Hebrew Bible version most people know. It is shorter. It has different arrangements. Scholars have debated for years whether the Qumran Jeremiah represents an older, independent textual tradition, a version of the book that predates the version that eventually became canonical. The text itself was already whispering that it had a different origin story. Now the parchment is saying the same thing. The words and the skin they were written on are telling the same story from two different directions. That is not coincidence. That is convergent evidence. The Cell paper named the research team's findings clearly and without hedging. This was not a preliminary blog post or a conference rumor. It was peer-reviewed science, published in one of the most respected journals in the world. And it said plainly that the provenance of these fragments had to be reconsidered. Not speculated about. Reconsidered. On the basis of hard biological data. So Jeremiah came from somewhere else. The question that immediately follows is the one that should keep you up at night. If Jeremiah was imported, what else was? How many other scrolls sitting in museum collections and archive vaults right now were carried into Qumran from places we haven't identified, by people whose names we will never know? And if the fragments came from multiple locations, how many of the joins that scholars built over decades were made between pieces that were never, in any meaningful sense, part of the same manuscript? That question has an answer, and the DNA already found some of it. The finding was precise, and it was damaging. Fragments that scholars had physically joined together, pieces that had been matched by eye, by text, by paleography, by every analytical tool available to the field for the better part of a century, were, in several cases, biologically incompatible. The DNA said they came from different animals entirely, not just different individual sheep, but different species. Pieces that had been living in the published record as matched pairs, as confirmed joins, as parts of a single unified manuscript, had never belonged together at all. This is not a minor editorial correction. This is a structural problem. Think about how scroll reconstruction works. A scholar identifies two fragments with matching handwriting and overlapping text. They propose a join. Other scholars review it, accept it, and the join gets incorporated into critical editions, museum exhibitions, and subsequent research. Papers get written on the assumption that those pieces are connected. Theological arguments get built on the assumption that those pieces are connected. And now, for at least some of those joins, the DNA is saying the foundation was wrong. Decades of published scroll reconstructions may rest on mismatched pieces. The scale of the problem is made clearer when you consider what the Israel Antiquities Authority is holding. Thousands more fragments sit in their collections. The vast majority of them have never been DNA tested. Every one of those untested fragments is a potential false join waiting to be discovered. Every reconstruction that touches an untested fragment carries an uncertainty that the field has not yet fully reckoned with. And here is the detail that makes the situation both more urgent and, strangely, more hopeful. The testing method is non-invasive. Researchers are not cutting into the scrolls. They are not dissolving precious parchment in chemical baths. They are working with scrapings so small they are practically invisible. Material collected from tape that had previously been used to handle fragments, or from the surface dust of the parchment itself. No damage, no loss. The texts are not harmed by the process. Which means there is no good scientific reason not to test more fragments. The barrier is not technical. It is institutional, financial, logistical. It is the slow grind of academic access and archival bureaucracy. But the capability exists right now to go through those thousands of untested fragments and systematically verify every join the field has ever proposed, to confirm which ones hold and which ones collapse. The deeper question, the one the research is circling without yet fully answering, is how many scrolls are sitting in the wrong order right now? How many chapters are misassembled? How many textual variants that scholars have agonized over are artifacts not of ancient scribal tradition, but of modern curatorial error? How many theological debates are, at their root, arguments about two pieces of parchment that were never meant to be read as one? The DNA has already answered that question for some fragments. The answer was not reassuring, and the scrolls, it turns out, are still keeping secrets that even the parchment has not finished giving up. The skin spoke first. The full story is still being translated. Subscribe now. The next revelation is already queued and waiting for you.